We're very fortunate today to have two speakers from the Evans School, and they will talk about changes in food security and also implications for inclusive democratic institutions in sub-Saharan Africa. In other words, food insecurity can threaten democracy. There's a connection between nutrition and politics. So the two speakers are from the Evans School. Dr. Didier Alia is research assistant professor at the Evans School. He's an agricultural economist with expertise in international development with a focus on agricultural transformation, the adoption of agricultural technology practices in the face of climate change. And his research covers a number of issues related to urbanization, education, health and trade, and their implications for rural development in Africa. And Dr. Amaka Naji is postdoctoral scholar at the Evans School, and her research deals with inequitable access to resources and the consequences of that on food security and well-being. She also deals with issues of poverty, education, and financial inclusion. So please welcome our two speakers. I'll let Dr. Didier Alia speak first, and then we'll switch, and then we'll have conclusion. And please be free to ask questions. We'd love to have a discussion. These are very interesting and provocative topics. Dr. Alia.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Thanks for attending the seminar today, and thanks for inviting us to present. So this seminar today is drawing from work that we have been doing at the Evans School as part of a group called the Evans School Policy Analysis Research Group. So it's a small group of faculty and postdoctoral researchers and graduate students coming together to do research on issues related to international development, food security, technology adoptions in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in South Asia. So the title of the presentation is Changes in Food Security and Implication for Inclusive Democratic Institutions in Sub-Saharan Africa. And I'll get into what we mean by inclusive democratic institutions and what we mean by food security in a minute. So we plan to structure this talk around the following questions. So first, we will discuss the trends and the current state of food security in sub-Saharan Africa. We'll then turn to discussing some of the issues like the threat and causes of that food insecurity, why food insecurity persistent in this part of the world. And then we'll go to the main topic or the main question that we are interested in, is whether food security, increased food insecurity can cause the decay of the quality of the democratic institution, the quality of governance in those countries. I will then turn to my colleague, Naji, Dr. Naji, who will discuss funding from other projects that we have connected to this topic. And she will talk mostly about what small households in sub-Saharan Africa are consuming, and what are the implications for food security in the future. And then talk about whether the current food systems as dominated by small-scale producers in this part of the world is prepared, or test whether the current system is prepared to respond to those changes. Finally, I will talk about an initiative that we launched last year. It's a center that we have at the Evans School, and that center's role is focusing on studying the role of risk and inclusion in food systems. So this graph summarizes what is the food security situation in sub-Saharan Africa. So the top red line there is the prevalence of undernourishment. Of course, there are many ways to measure food insecurity, many indicators of food insecurity, but one of them reported by the Food and Agricultural Organizations, which is the UN body responsible for food and agriculture internationally, is undernourishment. And it is measured as the proportion of individuals in a country that are unable to get the daily calorie need that they require. So those lines are global average. So the top line is the average for sub-Saharan Africa. The blue line with the markers are the world average, and I have the average for other regions. So clearly we can see here that the food security situation in sub-Saharan Africa is worse than the situation in most of the world. So this is a region where food insecurity remains a big problem. Between 2000 and 2012, food security has improved everywhere, also in sub-Saharan Africa. But unfortunately, we are seeing a reversal of trends. So food insecurity has started to go up again in sub-Saharan Africa, while it still remains low and decreasing in other parts of the world. This next graph is giving us individual countries' trajectories. So the global average can mask a lot of heterogeneity across country. By plotting the individual trends, we can see what's happening for each country. So clearly, we can see here that some countries are doing relatively well. So the top left corner is Angola, where food insecurity has decreased dramatically over the period of study. But there are countries where things are not going in the right directions. So another country, for example, is I think it is Madagascar and Lesotho, where we see food insecurity, which measured here as the prevalence of undernourishment is going up. There are assessments done by many organizations. So one of them is the USAID Food Fuse Net program, where they use detailed climatology data and detailed data on survey data to assess the food security situation of households. And this map is showing where households are facing acute food insecurity. So the recent estimate that they have conducted show that at most of 10% of sub-Saharan African households are currently facing acute food insecurity and require food assistance. And food insecurity is concentrated mostly in the Horn of Africa, which is this, like the area on the top, on the right, where we have Somalia, Ethiopia, and Sudan. But food insecurity is also very prevalent in what we call the Sahel regions. This is the country, the bands of area running from Mauritania all the way to Sudan and going through Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso. But of course, we have food security we have pockets of food insecurity in other parts of the continent as well. So why is food insecurity persistent in this part of the world? There are many studies done on that, so we know what are the root causes of food insecurity. Here I'm just listing 4 of them. So we have low agricultural productivity growth. We have poor and insufficient infrastructure. We have shocks. So shocks both at the local and global level. And we have the impact of climate change. So the next few slides, I'll go a little bit into detail on each of those causes. So when we talk about low productivity growth, this graph on the right summarizes it. So in the year 1961, pretty much agricultural productivity is low everywhere. The second line from the bottom, that's the average for Africa. And we also plotted the line for Nigeria, which is the largest country in terms of population on the continent. So you can see that pretty much agricultural productivity is low in Africa, but it's also low everywhere. What has happened is that everywhere productivity has increased vastly over time, but in sub-Saharan Africa, the line remains relatively flat. Consequently, crop yields today are 2 or 3 times lower in this part of the world than in other regions. And without sufficient productivity growth, we don't have enough food supply to feed people, and that's one of the root cause of food insecurity. One of the reasons we haven't seen this productivity growth in sub-Saharan Africa compared to other parts of the world is mainly due to the low use of modern inputs, like improved seed that should enable farmers to have high yield, fertilizer to supplement nutrient in the soil. And many farmers don't use machines to help them prepare efficiently their land. They are also not using crop protection chemicals. The consequence of that is that many harvests are at risk of being damaged by diseases, by insect attacks. So on the topic of poor infrastructure, only 53% of the roads in Africa are paved. And where you don't have paved roads during the rainy seasons, the roads are unusable. And if roads are unusable, you can get access to input. And if the input get to you, it will be expensive, so you can't afford it. So unpaved road and bad road conditions lead to high input costs, and consequently, you can have the input that you need to improve your productivity. But also prevents output from going from production zone to where consumption is happening. So output cannot be evacuated from production zone to market, and when they get there, they are expensive, and consumer cannot afford them. Many households also lack access to electricity, and only 5% of African agriculture is irrigated. When you don't have irrigations, you only rely on rainfall for productions, and rainfall tends to be erratic, rainfall tends to be unpredictable, and there are many years where rainfall is insufficient, so yield will be low. So most countries in Africa are net food importers, meaning that they buy more food from the rest of the world than they can sell. And because they rely on the market, they are vulnerable to any global shocks happening on the world stage. So recently, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has limited the availability of fertilizer, has limited the availability of grains to African households, and the price of all those produce have skyrocketed, so individual and households cannot afford them. There are also many wars and many local wars on the continent that disrupt production activities and market activities. So finally, the fourth cause is climate change. So although Africa is responsible to a very small portion of greenhouse gas emissions, models have suggested that it's a part of the world that will be most affected by the impact of climate change. So this map is showing the predicted rise in temperature by population density. And predictions have shown that many parts of the continent will experience temperature above 29 degrees Celsius, which will severely impact plant productivity. But not only that, it will also impact the ability of people to work and that impact people's productivity. And given that many farmers are not using machines and they are working with their hands, that will impact their productivity on the farm as well. The result is that yield is predicted to decrease by 15 to 20% if nothing is done, if drought-tolerant varieties are not developed and provided to farmers. So with this context in mind, establishing that food security remains high and food security continues to increase, the question that we are asking is what this means for governance, for inclusive institutions, for democracy. So the Nobel laureate Amartya Sen has famously asserted that no famine has ever taken place in the history of the world in a functioning democracy. And that claim is based on the observation that famines are not crises of supply, but mostly crises of distributions. That in autocratic regimes, dictators are able to evade the sanction from the population. They do not require the consent of the populations. And because of that, when there are crises, they tend to protect the elite first. In democratic regimes, through elections, through competitive elections, the population can punish leaders if the leaders are not delivering in terms of food security or in terms of good quality of life. So what we are trying to do in our work here is to see if these relations work in the reverse. So we know from science that famine cannot happen in a democracy. But when food insecurity becomes worse and when food insecurity increases, can this lead to the deterioration of the democratic process? And there are several channels, there are several ways to think about how food security can lead to, food insecurity can lead to affect the democratic process. First, if you are hungry, you are always irritated, right? So you are irritated, so there is an increased risk of social tensions when people are hungry. when people are hungry, they also tend to stay away from social events. They tend to stay away from political events. So food insecurity can decrease engagement into political and civic activities, which will reduce the expression of voice and limit people's ability to monitor the functioning of their government. So this is our framework, and this is the hypothesis that we are working from, that food insecurity can lead to this sort of social changes that will ultimately reflect into the deterioration of the quality of governance. So we need to, as economists, we work a lot with data, and we need to test if that holds in with data. So we need to bring the analysis to data. So for that, we need to answer two questions. How do we measure the quality of democracy? How do we know that a country is democratic or becoming more autocratic? So political scientists have two ways of doing this. The first one is the so-called expert assessment. So they bring together experts, people who know what is the governance, how governance should work, what is the democracy, and they use observation, they use data from how the country is functioning to rate countries on a scale of 0 to 1, with 0 being an autocracy, 1 being a perfect democracy. So that's one way to do that. You can use the expert opinion. The other way to do that, you can directly ask people. You can conduct a survey in the country and ask people what is their opinion about whether the country is a democracy, whether they support democratic regimes. Luckily for us, there is such survey available, and it's publicly available on the internet. There is this survey conducted every 2 to 3 years in many countries, both in Africa and Asia. It's called the Afrobarometer survey. And that survey measures people's satisfaction and belief about their government. So we can use data from both the individual's perception of democracy as well as expert assessment of the quality of democracy. How do we measure food security? I think in the class you have learned various indices of food security. You have learned about the minimum dietary adequacy for women. Here because we are interested in looking at cross-country data. We want data sources that are available for a lot of countries and available on a long historical time period. We use the prevalence of undernourishment. But the same analysis can be done with other indices of food security. So these three maps are sort of a visual representation of what democracy looks like currently in Africa. So the first one is the state of democracy in the period 1960 to 1989. And it is based on one of the index that I was talking about, the expert rating of the quality of democracy. During this period, many countries are just coming out of their independence, just exiting colonialism. So many of them immediately turn to autocracy. So we don't see a lot of democracy happening. It's not until the year 1990 where African countries have started to transition toward democracy. And this period is usually termed as the third wave of democratization. You can see that a lot of countries are now blue. So in this map, the darker blue means strong democracy, and the lighter blue means weak democracy. But despite this, the third map is showing us the prevalence of coup, where the military can forcibly remove a democratically elected president from office. We see here that there are many countries where this happened a lot, sometimes up to 8 times in this short period between 1990 and 2023. So there is a lot of movement toward democratization, but there's a lot of reversal as well, where the quality of democracy is decreasing. This is another set of graphs summarizing the same evidence. So here we are plotting the value of the quality of democracy in the year 2001 compared to the value of democracy in the US 2021. So countries at the top are where and this has improved, indicating that they have made more progress towards strong democracy. And countries in red at the bottom are where they have regressed. You can recognize some of those countries like Mali, where there has been a recent coup, and there's still a military in power until as of now. So this is what we are using in our data analysis. As I said before, we formulate a hypothesis, but we want to test that to see if it holds in the data. So we bring all this together and we use statistical analysis, so don't pay too much attention to that. I will explain what all this means in a minute. But we use some sort of statistical analysis to look at the relationship between food insecurity, here as measured by undernourishment, and the indices of democracy. So the red numbers here and the red number are telling us the strength of the correlation between those two variables, given that we have control for a lot of other things. And the negative sign means that as food insecurity here increase, the quality of democracy decrease. So they are going in opposite directions. This analysis has been done using the expert opinions. And this graph is exactly telling the same thing as the table before. So this is a visual representation of the table that I was showing. So the line is downward slope, meaning that as the prevalence of undernourishment is getting higher, meaning that food insecurity is becoming worse, the quality of democracy is going down, that there is a deterioration in democracy. We replicate the same analysis, this time using individual level survey data sets. So the survey data I was talking about, where the researcher asks individuals what they feel about the quality of the democracy in their country and whether they support democracy. Again, here the first two rows are whether the individual has missed food, and we see that once you miss food, you are less likely to report that your country is a democracy. So if you experience some sort of hunger, you are more likely to say that your country is not a democracy. And because you said that, the last two columns is whether you support democracy and whether you think that democracy is a good thing, you are also likely to say that democracy is not a good thing. So you sort of like being dissatisfied with democracy. So I showed the table, but this is a graphical representation of the same information. So the scale on the X scale are your experience of hunger, the number of times you experience hunger, and on the Y-axis is your perception of democracy, and we see that the line is downward slope. So in summary, for this particular analysis that we did, we started with a hypothesis that democracy cannot lead to famine, and this hypothesis was formulated by Amartya Sen. But we want to look at the reverse. We want to see whether if food insecurity is happening, this can lead to the decay of the institutional value in the country. So we did this analysis using both aggregate data at the country level, but also individual perception level data. And in both cases, we found strong support for the hypothesis. So what does all this mean? It means that not only food security on its own is good, because it's good for individual people, it's a desirable outcome, but that if you promote food security, this is another way of promoting democratic values. This is another way of promoting good democratic governance. And democracy, we know, at least historically, has been good for social and broader development, which is much needed in sub-Saharan Africa. So I'll pause here, and if you have questions on this particular topic, we can return to it, but I'll pass the floor to my colleague to talk about her work.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Didier. And thank you guys for still being here at this time. So, piggybacking off the discussions by Didier, we've established that food insecurity is not desirable. Lots of negative consequences of food insecurity. For example, health issues, nutrition, a loss of cognitive skills, social development, amongst others. We have also established that food insecurity can also lead to democratic backsliding. So in all of this, there's a need to find a way for food systems in low and middle income countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, to be able to support food security. To do this, we need to understand what people are consuming, what households are consuming, and how they get their food. So with this in mind, at EPA, we carry out a project to construct household consumption indicators that show changes in how households source their food from different sources over time. And to do this, we create consumption data from multiple household surveys. Here, consumption is based or is categorized on whether households source their food from the markets, from purchases, whether their food is sourced from, is received as gifts from other households, from non-governmental organizations or from the national government, or if the source of food is from their own production, so subsistence farming. One of the major contributions of this project really is that we're able to curate a large data set, and we cover as much as 19 countries. Many of these countries for which have several data points in this data set. So we curate about 45 waves of data. Also, the data curated for this study is nationally representative, and it captures both urban and rural households. We're also able to disaggregate the indicators by gender of household head. So moving on, the graph here presents the percentage value of household consumption from different sources. And the estimates presented in this graph are for the most recent waves of the data of the countries that are created. The green bar represents household share of food consumed from purchases, so food bought from the market. The orange bar, denotes household consumption from their own production, and the blue bar is household consumption from gifts. So overall, we see that the share of food consumed from purchases is increasing. And when you look closely at this graph, you find that for the majority of countries represented here, about 75% of food consumed in households is from purchases. So moving on, we present the same analysis here, but for the full data set, for all waves of countries that were created. And we disaggregate by the location of household. So the bar graph to the left shows the household consumption from different sources for urban households. And the graph on the right presents the same information, but for rural households. And just comparing the two graphs, you can see the stark difference. So there is a difference in how households source their foods, between rural and urban households. Looking at the left bar graph, we see that for most countries presented here, more than 90% of food consumed in the household is from purchases. On the other hand, for rural households, a substantial amount of food consumed in the households is from their own production. And that makes sense, really, because we know that most farmers are located in rural areas, right? And practice subsistence farming, meaning they tend to consume what they produce. But then when we look at the trend analysis, we see that this has been decreasing over time. So over time, the share of food consumed from their own production has been decreasing. And when we disaggregate further by gender of household head, that difference increases further. So we find that female-headed households tend to consume more food from purchases and less food from their own production compared to male-headed households. For the blue graphs, for the blue bars rather, we see that the share of household consumption from gifts is higher for rural households compared to urban households. Also, disaggregating by gender, we find the same result. So female-headed households consume more from gifts compared to male-headed households. So moving on, we have shown evidence that the majority of food consumed in sub-Saharan African countries are from purchases. But then we'd also want to know exactly what they're consuming. So to answer this question, we analyze consumption data from the Nigerian General Household Panel, 4 waves of the Nigerian General Household Panel. And the graph here presents the share of household consumption of major food groups in Nigeria. So from this graph, we see that for the average Nigerian household, they consume a lot of starchy crops. So rice, other cereals here encompass crops like sorghum, millet, wheat. Roots and tubers there include cassava, cocoyam, yam. We also see that vegetables are being consumed, but not as much as the starchy staples. Also, food consumption seems to be increasing, but marginally so. So as was discussed in an earlier slide by my colleague Didier, in addition to food insecurity, households in sub-Saharan Africa are also at risk of nutrition security. A question we might want to ask, and a question that is also important to answer too, is if food systems in sub-Saharan Africa are able to respond to changes in consumption. To answer this question, my colleagues and I in IPA carried out another analysis to explore if and to what extent changes in downstream consumption in the food system is transmitted to upstream producers. So to give a bit of background on the study, we know that small-scale producers are important actors in global food systems. In most low and middle-income countries, a substantial portion of food consumed in countries are produced by small-scale producers. So there's been a push by national governments, international organizations to harness the ability of small-scale producers to achieve food security goals. A substantial body of evidence has found, has explored the impacts of agricultural production on dietary diversity, but there's a gap in the reverse relationship. So we at IPA fill this gap, we address this gap by attempting to, examine the reverse relationship, which will be how consumption patterns affect domestic production decisions. Basically, we try to assess the extent to which small-scale producers adapt their production decisions to reflect changes in aggregate consumption. We theorize that if small-scale producers are able to receive and correctly interpret, market signals such as changes in aggregate consumption, we hope to see, or we expect to see a corresponding change in their production decisions and in the portion of land they allocate to the cultivation of these crops. Hence, we hypothesize that an increase in aggregate consumption of a crop will result in increased production of the same crop in a subsequent period. So, in order to test this hypothesis, we analyzed the three waves of the National Representative Panel data. That's the Nigerian General Household Survey. And we used the first three waves. So the waves collected in 2010 and 2011, 2012, 2013, and 2015, 2016. The reason why we have these 2 years is because they collect this data in 2 visits, a post-planting visit and a post-harvest visit. So for this analysis, we group food crops into broad categories: maize, rice, other cereals, roots and tubers, pulses, all the way down to groundnuts. And we define market size in terms of the aggregate consumption in the states where the household resides. So for our empirical analysis, we implement a seemingly unrelated regression equation, and this is to account for the joint decision-making process of small-scale producers. So during planting season, farmers have to make a decision on what crops to produce and the amount of land to allocate to the production of these crops. I have to make decision at the same time. So we implement this regression model to account for that decision-making process. So moving on to our findings. The data indicates that small-scale producers are involved in the simultaneous production of several crops. And what this means is a single household can produce, say, a little of maize, of cassava, and yams at the same time. And of course, this decision involves trade-offs amongst crops because production resources, for example, land and labor, are limited and scarce. So they have to make trade-offs. Recall that we are trying to do this to see how production decisions at the household level responds to changes in aggregate consumption. So findings from our regression analysis show that for some crops, in this case, roots and tubers, pulses, plantains, and bananas, production is increasing to keep up with increasing consumption. Good. But then it's not the case for all crops, unfortunately. And an implication of this finding is that over time, the risk of food insecurity might increase if the crops that are not responding to these market signals are the most consumed. Basically, an understanding of the extent to which downstream consumption changes in the food system are transmitted to upstream producers is important for policies that aim to increase national food security. Now I'll hand the mic over to Didier to round up.
Thanks, Amaka. I think we are very close to the end of our talk today. I mentioned at the beginning that we at the Evans School will launch a new center, and this center is called the Center on Risk and Inclusion in Food Systems. And what we are trying to do as part of this center is to understand the role that risks plays in decision making, especially for small-scale producers in sub-Saharan Africa. Why is that important? The piece of work that we presented have shown a couple of interesting findings. The first one is that food insecurity remains an issue and is increasing, and that is not good for inclusive governance, so we need to do something about it. Of course, people have been thinking about this question for a long time, but one important fact is that there has been decades of technological innovation in agriculture. There has been the Green Revolution in South Asia, where they have tripled productivities. Food insecurity is no longer an issue in many parts of the world. The productivity of crops is very high. So the technology sometimes exists. But what we also notice from our work and from the literature is that small-scale farmers in sub-Saharan Africa are not using the improved technologies, even when those technologies are available to them. And for many farmers, farming is sort of like a cultural thing. They are sort of attached to the way they have been farming historically, so that they are really hesitant to move away from the status quo. So there is an element of risk involved. So the center that we have launched is going to try to do more research and more policy engagement on this topic and to understand what the role risk, why people are not using innovations, what's the role risk play in those innovations. And we are hoping that by engaging on the field farmers and policymakers and funders, because we also work with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who is a big funder in this space, we can sort of contribute to the transformation of African agriculture and improvement of food security over time. Okay, so I think that's what we have, and if you have...
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Brilliant. Questions from the audience, Dr. Alia or Dr. Naja? Yes, go ahead. Question? I have a question. So, you have a question up there? Speak up. I can barely see you. Yes, loud.
In what direction are food preferences in Africa moving following urbanization?
Excellent. Direction of food preferences in Africa.
I can say a word about it and then you can complement that. So that's a very important question because urbanization is on the rise, as you can tell, like a lot of, if you didn't saw this, but there is the African is part of the world that is urbanizing fast and also have a very young population. So one of the graphs that was shown by Maka is here. This is a pretty much recent data as of 2018, and it is still showing a huge consumption of staple crops. So we are not seeing the type of diet preference change that we have seen elsewhere, where when urbanization happens, we see an increase in consumption of meat products, of dairy products, and like people shifting away from starch. I think starches are still dominant in many African diets. But interestingly, what is rising mostly now is rice. So Africans don't used to consume a lot of rice before, but now they are consuming a lot of rice. And much of this rice is imported rice. And because it's imported rice, whenever there is a small issue on the world stage, not small issue, but whenever there's an issue on the world stage, the price of rice will go up like 2-3 times, and that affects food security.
There's a question I absolutely have to ask. So rising food prices and therefore food insecurity back in 2008, 2010 were the main reason for the so-called Arab Spring, the toppling of several governments in North Africa. And so in this case, some of those regimes were in name democratic, but not really. But Amartya Sen's mechanism was through voting. Like, democracies can vote out a government and bring another one in. But in this particular case, food insecurity led to the toppling of governments that were not democratic, and it was nothing to do with voting. It was direct action. So that is somewhat interesting, because food insecurity is a very powerful mechanism that pretty much can topple any regime, democratic or not, through a variety of mechanisms. You have a comment on that? So it's like really a major connection between food insecurity and politics, exactly as you've been telling us. Comment about that? Yes.
No, that's a very relevant observations. We didn't discuss too much the Arab Spring because we didn't include them in the data analysis, but that's the typical case where you can see the forces of food insecurity leading to institutional changes. But what I will say is that, unfortunately, the changes that has happened after the Arab Spring wasn't really, there was a small movement toward democratization, but most of those countries have now reversed back to some sort of autocracy, although there are like frequent elections happening. You want to comment on it?
So on the question, I just want to talk about it from another perspective. So a study has found that with increasing urbanization, globalization, market integration, consumer preferences are changing towards more processed foods. And of course, we know that would have implications for nutrition too, right? Micronutrient deficiencies and all. So that's another way to think about changing food preferences.
I want to comment on this slide that we see over here, because what you're seeing is decline in consumption of roots and tubers, that'll be cassava, decline in consumption of coarse grains, sorghum and millet, and according to Bennett's law, it's very predictable. Cassava is replaced by yams. Cassava is replaced also by maize that's growing up, and maize in the end is replaced by rice, and rice at the end is replaced by wheat, which is already happening in Asia, but not in Africa. So paradoxically, consumption of rice in Asia is dropping, which is being replaced by wheat, and consumption of rice is increasing in Africa, with replacing other crops. It's very predictable, and based on laws of economics, you can pretty much predict the future. Bennett's law is the one that we talked about, and it is also responsible for the increasing amount of animal protein in the diet, which is completely tied to the country's socioeconomic status. So very much food preferences and the food supply very much depend on the economic status, and also the functioning of institutions. I see the point here, linking things up to the correct functioning of institutions. So that's very interesting indeed. So again, this is completely consistent with Bennett's law, which is linked to the animal protein, plant protein ratios across the world. And in these countries, all of those countries will be consuming much more plant protein than animal protein. I think the ratio here is going to be about 60% or so plant protein to 40% animal protein or even less. So I think this is very interesting, kind of combination of economics, politics, you heard it, and nutrition. Very nice. Any other questions? Yes, there's a question over there and another one over here. Let's start over there.
How do you, I know this is a very context-specific situation, and it may not apply at all, but how does this idea of democracy
said, you know, food security is not related to how much is being produced, but to distribution. In U.S., you know, there is a lot of production, but that isn't necessarily correlated to distribution. So, yeah, how does that apply here?
Well, that's a very good point. Most of the data that I was talking about, they also rate high-income countries, like the US, France, Germany. And it's not shown in our slide, but if you look at the data, you also see, at least in recent years, with the rise of populism and rise of some streams, not like some form of politics, we've seen some dips in the democratic score in those countries. It's not necessarily about food security. There are other forces involved. I think some of the rapid societal changes happening are some of the forces behind some, like the rise in conservatism and some of the democratic backsliding that we might be seeing in the West. I'll say that is the issue that sub-Saharan Africa is facing in terms of democracy, and this is a region where democracy is not really solid yet. So like anything can make democracy vacillate. But in high-income countries, the forces driving democratic backslidings are different.
One last question. Go ahead.
Yeah, so there is obviously a lot changing in terms of food preferences, politics, aggregate consumption, technological innovation that's not being used. And there's a lot of looking at the household level, but are there like studies and research taking into account how the children of these households are being affected by all this change?
However, that's very good point. Like we know that looking at the household, you miss a lot of things happening inside the household. Even not just children, but like consumption pattern for individuals within the household, especially women, are different from when you look at the household. Like women tend to, at least in this region and probably everywhere, tend to sacrifice a lot in terms of nutrition to be able to provide for their children. So our direct work hasn't looked at that, but there are works, even in high-income countries, on issue around child poverty. Like you can see poor and children within wealthy households, and this has to do with how resources are distributed within the household. So there are a lot of research on that, but not that what we presented today.
Yeah, I think the reallocation of resources within the family is not really picked up by households, but it can be done in individual studies.
Yeah.
It's a very interesting issue. And as Didier said, the reallocation of resources within the family is unequal, and very often women and children do suffer within the household. Yes, absolutely true.
Just one study that I've seen also mentioned in the context of sub-Saharan Africa is they look at how right after harvest, when income goes up, you see an increase in the consumption of alcohol and tobacco by the head of the household, instead of reallocating that windfall increase in income toward like consumption of nutritious food. Because whenever they get suddenly rich, right after harvest, when they are selling their produce and getting food, they tend to spend away from the food in terms of not nutritious food consumption items. So there are research on that.
Okay, thank you both very much. That was fantastic. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.